3 excavators were chewing through my family's land before I even had time to pull my truck onto the shoulder. And the man standing there with his arms crossed actually smiled when he saw me. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Relax, Mr. Harper. We're building something the whole community will enjoy." What none of us knew in that moment was that those machines weren't just digging up dirt. They were digging up the one secret that would destroy his entire life. My name is Thomas Harper. I'm 69 years old, retired after nearly 4 decades as a high school history teacher, and I live just outside Morro Bay on California's Central Coast. My grandparents bought our little ranch back in 1926 when this area was mostly cattle, farms, and ocean fog rolling over the hills every morning. 6 acres isn't much by ranch standards, but to my family it was everything. Every fence post had a story. Every oak tree had someone's initials carved into it decades before I was born. My wife, Linda, used to joke that I could probably identify every rock on that property by first name. Maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. We raised our kids there, buried our old dogs there, celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, graduations. Life happened on that land. Then, about 7 years ago, a developer bought the neighboring ranch, carved it into expensive homes, and created what they proudly called Cypress Ridge Estates. Along with those shiny new houses came an HOA. Now here's the important part. My property wasn't inside that HOA. It had existed long before their subdivision, and legally my land remained completely independent. I wasn't required to join, pay dues, or follow any of their rules. Most of the neighbors accepted that. A few even admitted they were jealous. But one man absolutely couldn't stand it. His name was Gregory Bennett, the newly elected HOA president. Gregory wasn't loud. That would have been easier to deal with. He was polished, always smiling, always talking about community values and neighborhood improvements. The kind of man who could insult you while making it sound like he was paying you a compliment. The first time he knocked on my door, he brought homemade cookies. "Tom," he said, "like we've been friends for years, your back acreage would make a beautiful community garden, walking paths, meditation spaces, maybe even yoga classes. We'd love to buy it." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. He slid a folder across my kitchen table with an offer that would have impressed a lot of people. But money wasn't the point. That patch of land had been in my family for nearly a century. My father taught me how to mend fences there. My daughter learned to ride horses there. My grandson caught his first fish in the little seasonal creek after a heavy winter. You don't sell memories because someone wants prettier landscaping. I thanked him for the offer and told him no. Gregory smiled the same practiced smile and said, "Think about what's best for everyone." I answered, "I already have." That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning. Over the next few months, little things started happening. Survey flags mysteriously appeared just inside my fence line. HOA newsletters mentioned plans for future green spaces that suspiciously matched the shape of my property. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to suddenly asked whether I'd considered selling for the good of the community. One afternoon, I caught 2 men in reflective vests taking measurements along my back fence. When I asked who hired them, they packed up so fast you'd think I'd caught them stealing. Linda told me to document everything. She always had better instincts than I did. I figured Gregory was just another pushy HOA president with too much free time. She said, "No, Tom. Men like that don't hear the word no. They hear maybe later." Looking back, she understood him long before I did. Then came the town hall meeting. I wasn't even planning to attend, but several neighbors suggested I should hear what Gregory had to say. Halfway through his presentation, he projected a rendering of the neighborhood's future expansion. There it was, my back field transformed into gardens, benches, walking trails, picnic tables, my property. My fence wasn't even in the picture anymore. I stood up and interrupted him. "Gregory," I said, "you forgot one small detail. You don't own that land." The room went quiet. He didn't miss a beat. "Some property questions are still being reviewed," he replied smoothly. "We're optimistic everyone will reach a reasonable agreement." I looked around the room and realized people actually believed him. They thought negotiations were ongoing. They thought I'd eventually give in. After the meeting, I confronted him in the parking lot. "There are no negotiations," I told him. "The answer is still no." He leaned closer, lowered his voice, and said something I'll never forget. "Every piece of land has a price, Tom. If it isn't money, it's pressure." Then he got into his SUV and drove away like he'd just discussed tomorrow's weather. I went home uneasy for the first time in years. The next morning, I pulled every deed. survey and county record my family had ever kept. If Gregory planned to create pressure, I wanted facts waiting for him. For the next 2 weeks, my dining room looked less like a home and more like a county records office. Old surveys, yellowed deeds, tax maps, handwritten notes from my grandfather. Everything was spread across the table while Linda kept bringing me coffee and reminding me to eat. The deeper I dug into our family's paperwork, the more confident I became. There had never been a utility easement across our land, never a public access agreement, never a forgotten clause tucked into some dusty document that Gregory could twist into his favor. The county recorder confirmed it. A retired surveyor I'd known for years confirmed it. Even the planning department laughed when I asked whether Cypress Ridge had any authority over my property. Not even close, the clerk told me. That should have settled everything. But logic only works on reasonable people, and Gregory had already crossed into something else entirely. 3 weeks later, I noticed fresh orange paint marks running through the back meadow. They hadn't been there the day before. Someone had marked a straight line right through the center of our property, as if construction had already been approved. I photographed every mark, every flag, every footprint. Then I hired an attorney named Rebecca Lawson, a woman with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent years cleaning up other people's arrogance. She studied every document I brought and leaned back in her chair. "Tom," she said, "they don't have a legal leg to stand on. But that doesn't mean they won't try something reckless." Together, we sent Gregory a certified letter demanding that no contractors enter my land under any circumstances and reminding him that any unauthorized work would constitute trespassing and property damage. Rebecca suggested including one more paragraph because she had noticed something interesting while reviewing old geological surveys from the county archives. Decades ago, before my grandfather bought the property, a university team had documented possible prehistoric artifacts somewhere near the western ridge. Nothing had ever been excavated, but there was enough evidence to recommend caution before disturbing the soil. Becca added that information to the letter. It wasn't dramatic. It simply advised that if any construction occurred, appropriate archaeological procedures should be followed. Gregory signed for the letter 3 days later. We had proof he received it. I slept better knowing that. Unfortunately, Gregory apparently slept even better after reading it. 91 days passed without incident. I started believing maybe he'd finally accepted reality. Then came a Thursday morning in early September. Linda wanted flowers from the nursery in town, so we drove into Morro Bay after breakfast. We were gone less than 3 hours. As we turned onto our road, I noticed dust hanging in the air before I could even see the house. My stomach tightened. Heavy equipment makes a certain sound that's impossible to mistake once you spent a lifetime around ranches. Diesel engines, hydraulic arms, steel tracks grinding over dry earth. I accelerated. When the property came into view, I felt my chest go cold. 3 excavators, 2 bulldozers, a dump truck, and nearly a dozen workers were already inside my back fence. Half the fence itself had been ripped down and stacked in a pile like firewood. One massive oak tree my grandfather planted after returning from World War II lay on its side with roots pointing toward the sky. I slammed the truck into park before it fully stopped. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted as I ran toward the machines. One operator actually lifted his blade and waved like I was interrupting a friendly conversation. Gregory appeared from behind a white pickup wearing pressed jeans, sunglasses, and one of those reflective construction vests that people wear when they want to look important. "Good timing," he said with that same polished smile. "We're finally moving forward with the community wellness project." I could barely believe what I was hearing. "You're trespassing," I yelled. "Every one of you is trespassing." He calmly handed me a folded piece of paper. "Utility easement authorization," he said. One glance was enough to know it was nonsense. The document referenced an easement recorded in 1934 under a file number that didn't even match the county's numbering system from that decade. Whoever created it either didn't understand public records or assumed nobody would bother checking. I tore the copy in half. Gregory didn't even flinch. "You can discuss it with our attorneys," he replied before motioning for the operators to continue. The machine started moving again as if I didn't exist. Linda was already on the phone with the sheriff's department while I called Rebecca. Deputies arrived about 40 minutes later. They looked uncomfortable the moment they stepped out of their cruisers. One deputy quietly admitted they viewed it as a civil dispute because Gregory claimed the HOA possessed legal documentation. I handed over every deed, survey, and certified letter I had in the truck. The deputy studied them, frowned, then walked over to Gregory for a long conversation I couldn't hear. Construction slowed, but didn't stop. The deputies couldn't order everyone off the property without a court order. It felt like watching someone rob your house while the police suggested filing paperwork. Then something happened that changed everything. One excavator scraped through a section of dark soil near the old creek bed. I noticed the operator hesitate before climbing out of the cab. At first, I assumed he'd hit an old irrigation pipe, but when I walked closer, I saw something pale lying in the dirt. It wasn't shaped like wood or stone. It looked wrong. I knelt down and gently brushed away loose soil with my fingers. A curved piece of bone emerged, followed by tiny shell beads, unlike anything I'd ever seen. Another worker called out that he'd found more pieces a few yards away. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even Gregory looked uncertain now. One of the deputies stepped closer and quietly said, "Nobody touch another thing." I remember the paragraph Rebecca had insisted on including in that certified letter, the one about possible archaeological material. And suddenly every hair on my arms stood up. Linda whispered, "Tom, do you think this is what they warned about?" I didn't answer because I honestly didn't know. What I did know was that instinct told me this wasn't ordinary. I called the county archaeological office immediately. To my surprise, someone answered right away. I explained what we'd found, described the beads, the bones, the disturbed soil, and there was a long pause before the woman on the other end asked one question. "Has construction stopped?" I looked over at Gregory. He was arguing with one of the deputies, insisting everything needed to continue because delays were costing the HOA money. I answered honestly, "Not yet." Her voice changed instantly. "Keep everyone away from that area. We're dispatching a team now. Do not allow anyone to remove anything." Less than 3 hours later, 4 archaeologists arrived along with state officials carrying equipment I'd never seen before. They carefully examined the exposed ground, speaking quietly among themselves while marking locations with small colored flags. Their expressions grew more serious with every passing minute. Finally, the lead archaeologist walked over to me. "Mr. Harper," she said softly, "I need you to understand the significance of what we're seeing here." I nodded, hardly breathing. "This appears to be an ancient indigenous burial site." Gregory laughed from 20 feet away. Actually laughed. "Come on," he said loudly. "A couple old bones don't stop a community project." The archaeologist slowly turned toward him, removed her glasses, and said something that silenced every person standing there. "These are not just old bones. If our preliminary assessment is correct, your equipment has disturbed a protected Native American cemetery that may be over 2,000 years old. And if that's true, this stopped being a property dispute the moment your bulldozer started digging." She reached for her phone, stepped away from the crowd, and made a call that none of us could hear. About 15 minutes later, she returned with an expression that told me everything had changed. "The State Historic Preservation Office has been notified," she said. Then she looked directly at Gregory. "And federal authorities are being contacted as well." The next morning, my quiet ranch looked like the center of a major crime scene. Federal vehicles rolled through the front gate before sunrise. Yellow evidence markers covered the disturbed ground, and agents politely but firmly told everyone except the investigators to stay behind the temporary fencing. By noon, a chain-link security fence surrounded the entire burial area. Cameras had been installed, and signs referencing federal protection laws were hanging every 50 feet. Gregory arrived around 10 wearing another expensive polo shirt and that same confident smile I'd grown to hate. He marched straight toward one of the agents and demanded the fence be removed because, according to him, the HOA owned an easement through the property. The agent asked for the documentation. Gregory proudly handed over the same fake easement he'd shown me the day before. The agent studied it for less than 30 seconds before looking back at him. "Where exactly did this document come from?" Gregory suddenly looked less certain. "Our legal department has had it for years." That answer didn't satisfy anyone. Over the following weeks, the investigation moved faster than I ever imagined. Archaeologists uncovered multiple burial locations along with ceremonial shell beads, stone tools, and cultural artifacts dating back more than 2,000 years. Representatives from a local Native American tribe visited the site, and watching them stand silently where their ancestors had been disturbed was one of the most emotional moments I've ever witnessed. One elder thanked me for stopping the construction when I did. I remember telling him I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I had simply tried to protect my family's land. He smiled gently and replied, "Sometimes protecting your family also protects someone else's history." I'll never forget that. Meanwhile, the investigators uncovered something even worse for Gregory. Rebecca called me one afternoon sounding unusually excited. "Tom," she said, "we got the discovery documents." Buried inside hundreds of emails was one message Gregory had sent to the construction company only 5 days before the excavation began. It read, "Ignore the archaeological warning. Harper is bluffing to delay the project. Finish the grading before he can get another injunction." I just sat there staring at the paper. He hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't overlooked the certified letter. He had read it, discussed it, dismissed it, and deliberately ordered everyone to keep digging anyway. That single email changed the entire case. His attorney tried calling it poor judgment. Federal prosecutors called it evidence of willful destruction. The story exploded across television and online news. Every station seemed to have the same headline: HOA president ignores historic warning. Damages ancient burial site. Reporters camped outside the subdivision for days. Homeowners who had once applauded Gregory suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. HOA board members resigned one after another, each insisting they had never approved entering my property. Contractors filed claims saying they had relied on false legal documents. Insurance carriers refused coverage after learning the excavation had proceeded despite written warnings. Property values dipped almost overnight because nobody wanted their neighborhood associated with a federal criminal investigation. Months later, I finally sat inside the federal courthouse. Gregory looked nothing like the confident man who had stood beside those bulldozers. His expensive suits couldn't hide the exhaustion on his face. The prosecutors presented the fake easement, the certified letter, the email ordering construction to continue, testimony from archaeologists, county officials, and tribal representatives. There wasn't much left to argue. Before the trial could reach a jury, Gregory accepted a plea agreement. He admitted responsibility for authorizing the unlawful excavation and knowingly ignoring documented warnings. The judge sentenced him to federal prison, ordered substantial financial restitution to support tribal preservation efforts, and permanently prohibited him from serving on the board of any homeowners association after his release. The HOA itself agreed to fund a cultural education center, pay for complete restoration of the damaged site, and record a permanent conservation easement protecting that portion of my land forever. Any future attempt to disturb it would trigger massive financial penalties before a single shovel touched the ground. A year later, I walked through the restored meadow with my grandson. The heavy equipment was gone. Native grasses had returned. Small interpretive markers stood quietly along a protected path approved by the tribe, not as a tourist attraction, but as a respectful reminder that some places carry stories far older than any neighborhood development ever could. My grandson asked why I never sold the land when Gregory offered so much money. I looked across the field where 4 generations of my family had worked the soil and answered as honestly as I could. Because once you sell something that holds your family's history, you never get to buy it back. What none of us understood at the time was that our family's history wasn't the oldest story buried beneath that ground. We had simply been trusted to protect it until the right moment arrived. Gregory believed land was just another asset waiting to be acquired, another square on a map he could color however he wanted. In the end, the very ground he tried to steal became the witness that convicted him. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive because one person is stronger than another. Sometimes justice has been waiting beneath your feet for thousands of years, patient enough to let arrogance dig its own grave. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted the money and walked away before any of this happened? Or would you have fought to protect your family's land, no matter the cost? And do you believe Gregory deserved prison? Or was the punishment too harsh for what began as a land dispute? Share your thoughts in the comments because I read every one of them. And if this story reminded you that standing your ground still matters, don't forget to like, subscribe, and pass it along to someone who's ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA or anyone who forgot that some things simply aren't for sale.